Welcome to the Clinical Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, we are able to make science more accessible and understandable.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the May 2026 edition of the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Special thank you again to our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, for making it possible for us to be here together. I'm Remley Crow, and today I am joined by our panel, Dr. Tony Fernandez, Jeff Rollman, Michael Caduce, Dave Page, and Bill Toon. As always, our discussion will be paired with an article in EMS World, written by our very own Michael Caduce. And this article is called Journal Watch. Encourage you all to check it out at emsworld.com under the category of education and training. And now I see a lot of you popping in live here. Thank you for joining. As we begin, let me remind you, you all can put your comments or questions in at any time during this podcast, and we will bring those into the discussion as we go. And without further ado, reminding everyone, the name of the article that we're looking at today is a retrospective comparison of Plunger-Type and band-type mechanical chest compression devices for pre-hospital resuscitation. This is published in Pre-Hospital Emergency Care. And so you've heard of man versus machine, been a lot of those studies. This is machine versus machine. Unfortunately, Dr. Tanner Smita was not able to join us today, who is the lead author of this paper, as he is working on becoming a double doctor and he is in his surgical rotations. So he was kind enough to share a slide deck with us that we'll be using as we go through. Now we've got an excellent panel who's going to guide us. We've got Jeff will take us through some background information. Tony will take us through the methods, and Michael will lead off our discussion. I'll be guiding results, but please enter your comments, questions anytime as we go, and we're going to have a lot of fun with this one. So I'll turn it over to Jeff to talk a little bit about the plunger style devices versus band style devices and set up why this study matters for us.
Thank you, Dr. Crow, and definitely appreciate you framing this with that big man versus machine studies that we know that are out there, which this is not. So just want to remind everyone that there are plenty of papers on that. Many of those are included in the references for this study, but we know that mechanical CPR is very common. It's increasingly common, but it's something that's still pretty controversial. Even though it's something that is increasingly common, especially in the transport realm, if it's a patient that is being transported with CPR in progress, we know that mechanical CPR is much safer for the actual EMS clinicians, or in resource-limited settings, for example. It may be in a rural setting where there's only 2 EMS clinicians working the entire cardiac arrest. But national guidelines and international guidelines still don't recommend routine use of mechanical CPR in all arrests. Rather, it's something that is generally considered selectively, that in those situations, the context of transport or limited EMS clinicians. So we're not looking at whether mechanical CPR beats manual CPR, but more so if we are already using mechanical CPR, or if we want to use mechanical CPR, which device type is better, or does that type of device matter at all? So this is comparing 2 device types, a plunger type device, which the main commercial application of this is the Lucas device, and then a band type device, and the main commercial version is the Zoll AutoPulse. And even though these are meant both to do chest compression similar to what a human would do, they're quite different in terms of how they're designed and how they actually work and their mechanism of action. So the Lucas, the plunger type device, that is most similar to what we can consider chest compressions in the sense of using that piston and a suction cup, almost like a plunger, to really compress and push down on that sternum directly. Whereas those band type devices, like the Zoll Auto Pulse, they use instead this circumferential thoracic compression. So instead of just pushing down in that one spot, it's really squeezing with that band all around the circumference. And it uses this idea of that thoracic pump mechanism. So again, it's not that compression, but really this pump of squeezing. So we already know that these are fundamentally different strategies when it comes to the actual biomechanics of how they're working. It's not just different brands, but really the physiology, in a sense, of these two devices is quite different. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the medical director or the EMS agency director or the government or whoever at the end of the day who's making these decisions needs to spend money down and needs to put some money on the table to buy these devices. And they need to decide which one to choose. And then once they choose it, we know that's going to affect training a bit since they're a bit different. It's going to affect maybe how they're deployed, maybe some of our quality improvement strategies, quality assurance might affect our replacement timeline, the maintenance costs, and really just integrating these mechanical CPR devices into our regular pre-hospital workflow for cardiac arrest. We know that these two devices can fit in a bit differently. So this is an excellent example of really deep academic thought. I would say in this paper, extremely well done by Dr. Smita and co-authors, but this is something that is super relevant for medical directors, EMS clinicians, administrators, those that are buying and procuring, as they need to ultimately decide which one to buy if they're making the decision to actually go ahead and buy a mechanical chest compression device. So like I was mentioning, like Dr. Crow was mentioning, there is definitely literature out there that explores both of these devices, both the band type and the plunger type. But those are really comparing these mechanical devices to manual CPR. To our knowledge, there's no studies out there that are actually comparing these two machines to each other. So this really fills a gap, this paper, that even though these devices have been around for a couple of decades, some of them, that no one has put them to the test head to head. So this is a really practical EMS question that we're finally getting some good answers to. So if that EMS system is already using some sort of mechanical CPR device, we want to see if one of these platforms, one of these devices or machines is associated with improved outcomes, improved cardiac arrest outcomes. So it's much more relevant, I would say, looking at these actual survival to discharge, rather than just maybe things like ROS or the chest compression fraction. So the idea that we are really looking at ROS versus survival, that definitely matters when it comes to our framing. But this device, we'll talk a little bit more about the methods, since the primary outcome of this was that pre-hospital return of spontaneous circulation. So just want to point out a couple of things for our different audiences here, since we know that we have many folks here that are listening to us, many that are listening to us live, many that are listening to us after the fact. And we know there's a lot of frontline EMS clinicians on here, EMTs and paramedics that are out there. And this question of the plunger type versus band type mechanical CPR device is really relevant, because we know that how we deploy these devices and when we deploy it, where it fits in, can matter just as much as the actual device itself. And the device choice, we know that these two devices can be different in terms of how long it takes to get it on, that speed of application, whether there are interruptions and compressions, how long those interruptions are, how it just fits into the scene. We know those dynamics of working a out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. There's not a lot of space. Could be pretty cramped, could be in a stairwell. I don't know about you, but it seems like half of them are in this tiny bathroom between the toilet and the tub and the wall, where there's not a lot of space there. So we're thinking often not necessarily about other matters, but just how does this fit? Can we get it on there? And this paper isn't going to necessarily tell us we need to throw out one device and switch to one tomorrow, but it definitely tells us about some of these real world consequences. And for the EMS educators on the line, we know that our training, when we're thinking of training around cardiac arrest management, it's not just reapply the mechanical CPR device. We need to actually think about the devices themselves, because that's going to affect our choreography of who's doing what and trying to minimize those pauses. Because ultimately, we know that what's really going to help these patients' survival is those basics, like continuous getting those chest compressions and minimizing those interruptions, and making sure that this device is placed appropriately. So we know that these devices are often put in the right spot initially, but do they stay there? That's another matter. We know that there are some studies that are out there that have looked at how these machines can sometimes move around a little bit in real life, and maybe the outcomes can be affected by the fact that they're going to move around a little bit. And this is probably variable between these two types of devices. So we really want to make sure that these machines are being used well, that the EMS system is able to apply these devices appropriately and really make sure that it works well within that pre-hospital cardiac arrest workflow. And what's also amazing about this study, this very well thought out study, is we know this is looking at real world EMS practice. This isn't in a lab setting. This isn't in a training situation where it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We have a ton of lights on. We're all pretty well rested. But this is real world EMS. We're looking at real world EMS data using a very large national database. So it is observational. We're looking at this after the fact, and we know that there sometimes can be some issues with the data, but this really gives us that real world application of where this fits in. So before I pass it back to Dr. Crow and Dr. Fernandez, just want to give us a few sort of questions or themes, some things that we can think about as we continue into this paper. But the main question I would say is that, are we sometimes too quick to treat all these mechanical CPR devices as equivalent? That we don't want to just be brushing all mechanical CPR devices as identical, that there's really some key differences, like I was mentioning, in terms of how these devices actually work and the physiology behind them. And then if we do see some sort of signal with our data and with our results, is it actually that machine itself, or is it how man is interacting with that machine? Is it that choreography with the machine? And that's something that really could be a system issue potentially, or EMS education issue. And then outcomes. So this device looks at pre-hospital ROS, return of spontaneous circulation, but there's a lot of different outcomes when it comes to cardiac arrest and evaluating different procedures, practices, treatments. So not always clear which outcome would be closest tied to what we're looking at. So I think this is a very well done study, and I'm glad that we're talking about this. Definitely wish that Dr. Smita could be here as well, but certainly fortunate to have one of the co-authors, Dr. Crow, here as well. So I'm going to pass it back to you, and looking forward to hearing more about this.
All right. Thank you for that helpful background. And this is an exciting study because a lot of times, we've read the research from the laboratory studies, the theory behind all of this makes tons of sense, but the real question is, how does it perform when it's used as intended in the environment where it was intended to be used? And that's exactly what this observational study does. Now, resuscitation research does not come without challenges. There are a lot of challenges in doing good resuscitation research, and there are, of course, limitations to real-world documentation. All of us, having been field providers, know some of those all too well. But this authorship team spent a lot of time and a lot of red pen and a lot of effort going through the different ways that we could think about bias and where might it be lying and how could we adjust for that, or how can we get closer to what would be like a randomized control trial. And so I'm going to turn it over to Tony to talk us through a little bit of the methodology that was used here before we dive into the findings.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. And yeah, this is it is a shame that Dr. Smita couldn't join us today, because I would he put a lot of work into this study, and it is definitely evident. And as the author team, thank you, Dr. Crow, for working on this study. I think this is definitely filling some gaps in the literature that we've been unable to fill previously. So let's start, as we always do. We'll talk about the objective, right? Or what they wanted to accomplish with this study, right? So they wanted to leverage a national data set to perform an observational comparison of outcomes for adult non-traumatic out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients using resuscitation patients using either the band type or the Plunger-Type mechanical CPR devices. Their primary outcome, as Jeff was discussing earlier, was pre-hospital return to spontaneous circulation, right? So ROSC, and they had some other outcomes that they assessed, their secondary outcomes, and we'll go through those as we progress through our methods here. But this was, they did state a hypothesis, and based on this previous literature that Jeff kind of went through, they hypothesized that the device type would not be associated with pre-hospital ROSC, which is interesting. They went with the null hypothesis, and we're going to see how that played out as we go through the methods and results. So this is their data source was the ESO Data Collaborative, and full disclosure, I work for ESO, Dr. Crow as well. But I love talking about a data set, so let's dive in here, right? So this is, as everyone knows, or most of you know on the call, ESO, we provide an electronic health record system to EMS agencies across the country, and most folks who use ESO voluntarily allow us to use their de-identified data for research and performance improvement. So the ESO Data Collaborative, it aggregates those de-identified data, the pre-hospital records, into a research data set, and it helps support studies like these. This is a free data set. There's a proposal process that goes to an external research leadership group, but these data are not, we don't sell these data. They're available to anyone who has a good research idea and wants to dive in and has some resources to do so, statistics wise. So all the data elements, right? They follow the National EMS Data Standard, NEMSIS version 3 standard, and the data set covers 2022 to 2024. So it wasn't just 1 year of data, which is great, particularly when we're talking about cardiac arrest. So we talked about the study design. This is a retrospective cohort study design. So again, we're looking back at existing records. We're not looking forward. And let's kind of dive in a little bit. So one of the things that is really important when you're designing a study like this is to really think out and spend a lot of time on your inclusion criteria, right? And one of the ways to do this that is being more and more utilized in epidemiological research is to do kind of a target trial emulation, right? So we're going to dive into how that is important in picking your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So essentially, what you're doing here is when you start, you think about how you'd want to run your pie in the sky randomized control trial, right? So who's eligible, what treatments and when do they start, what outcomes are you going to be assessing, and how long you would follow these patients. So those rules, setting those up, what we call a priori before the study starts, right? They protect you somewhat from a whole host of potential analytical errors and some bias, right? But you typically, while a lot of folks do spend a lot of time on these observational studies, identifying their inclusion, exclusion criteria, running through it as you would a potential clinical trial it helps make some of these decisions a little more crystal clear, right? So, for instance, things that you may that were really important in this study and that clearly were decided on a priority was in terms of which patients to include was when would you start that clock, right? That CPR clock, and that's something that you'd have to determine in a clinical trial that you may not think about in just in an observational study. And some of that can introduce bias, and we'll go through what some of that means. So again, before you're touching the data, you write it out as you would, who's eligible, who gets assigned the treatment, when the clock starts, what your outcome is, and how long you'd follow these patients. You design it as if it was a hypothetical trial as closely as possible. And one of the things that this prevents is what we call the immortal time bias, right? So what this is it refers to a period in the study where a patient didn't experience the outcome, cannot experience the outcome by definition, right? But still gets credit for it. So in other words, if you start the clock at the beginning of resuscitation for everyone, the patients who got the device a little later, it looks like potentially they may have survived longer before ROSC, but anything can happen in some of those patients, right? Because they were down longer, they may be sicker. So because the authors define this period where ROSC hasn't happened yet, the outcome couldn't be attributed to them. So you're in essence giving credit for survival when the intervention hasn't even started yet. So the authors define their time zero as the moment the device was actually initiated, right? Which exactly what they described in the paper. And from that moment forward, right, everyone's eligible and assigned, and they're followed out through the outcome. So you'd think of it as you wouldn't want to judge if you were talking about a medication like epinephrine, right? You wouldn't want to judge what happened before you gave epinephrine. It's a lot of the same logic here. So let's talk about who they included. Right. So they looked at adults 18 years of age or older, non-traumatic cardiac arrest, and they were treated with mechanical CPR. Right. They had some important exclusion criteria, and one was a DNR. Right. That makes a lot of sense. They excluded nursing home and healthcare facilities, right? And that probably makes sense, right? Because higher comorbidity burden, and it'd be hard or more difficult to attribute what actually happened in terms of the devices and the difference in devices. For the same reason, age patients over 80 were excluded, and that makes a lot of sense. If ROSC was achieved before mechanical CPR was started, those patients were excluded. Obviously, they had to exclude patients who didn't have the mechanical CPR start time. And then witnessed arrests, EMS witnessed arrests, these were also excluded, as were interfacility transports. As for the treatment group, they were classified, again, based on which device they use. So either the external plunger type, right, or the external band type. One thing that's important to note is this is not stratified by the specific manufacturer or model, right? It's either plunger type or band type. And the plunger type was the reference group. And we talked about how they define their time zero. So again, the primary outcome was pre-hospital return spontaneous circulation. And this was defined by the ROSC time in the EHR. There was no minimum duration required. And again, because ROSC doesn't take into account the full treatment of what happens to a patient, the authors also had some secondary outcomes. And one of those was ROSC after at least 20 minutes or 20 consecutive minutes, excuse me. They looked at survival to hospital discharge. And in this data set, about 20% of the patients had a linked outcome. And this is 20% to some folks who aren't familiar with EMS research. Might sound like a really small percentage, but having that level or that percentage of linked outcomes is unique. There aren't many data sets that can do that. And then outcomes were classified as surviving was discharged to home or a skilled nursing facility or a long-term acute care center. And then law enforcement, excuse me. And then dying wasn't just deceased. If you were discharged to a hospice, those are very different patients. So they were treated in the dying group. Now, I don't want to dive too deep into statistics and have everyone fall asleep on us, right? But they really did, the author team, make some really important decisions of what statistics that they actually used. So we should actually spend a little bit of time on this. So we're very familiar in folks who listen to this podcast about logistic regression, right? So it's a dichotomous outcome, yes, no. So did ROS happen or did it not? And they'll give us odds ratios. What's interesting about this study was the authors looked at kind of a multi-level analysis. So we know that they're nested in EMS agencies, right? So treating a patient treated by kind of a large urban fire department is likely different from one that's treated by a small rural volunteer service, right? So not just because of patient characteristics, but because of things like equipment, culture, protocol, staffing, those sorts of things. So the multi-level modeling that acknowledges this and kind of recognizes that patients within that were treated by the same agency or more similar to each other than patients that were treated by different agencies. So running this multi-level analysis is really helpful. They also did what we call a random intercept for EMS agency. And think of this as adjusting, right, for the fact that some departments run more cardiac arrests per year, maybe have more practice than other agencies, right? So you wouldn't want to compare survival or ROS for those two agencies at equal points, right? So you're going to want to, what this does is it gives you credit for, if your baseline survival is higher, we're going to kind of compare you against yourself, right? So the mixed model, it adjusts for what you measure, and it also accounts for things that you couldn't measure at the agency level. And before we move to the DAG, I just want to see, because Dr. Crow, I know you were heavily involved in a lot of these analytical choices. Is there anything that you think that I missed that was really important in choosing these methods for your analysis?
I think you highlighted it well, but I do want to emphasize that choice of a time zero. And that is one of the things that sets this research apart from a lot of other observational studies where the potential for what you were describing of resuscitation time bias really creeps in. And so here, the team thought long and hard about, well, how do we make sure that this is a fair comparison? And the best way to do that is to define a time zero for when eligibility for follow-up begins. And so this was defined for this study as the time that mechanical CPR was initiated as documented in the EPCR. And so the methodology behind this has fancy name, but the goal of it is rather simple. So this is called a target trial emulation. And what that means is we're doing our best to create the conditions that would be present if this was the ideal randomized controlled trial. Knowing that there's lots of limitations inherent in observational data, how can we come as close as possible to the ideal standard of an RCT? And so a big part of this is choosing a time zero that allows both groups to be eligible and comparable at the same time.
Absolutely. And I think that is one of the many things that increases the rigor of this study and makes it so valuable. So one of the other things that they did for this study was they developed a DAG, or a directed acyclic graph, right? And this is on the screen now for those of you listening afterwards. Um, it looks scary, but it's certainly not as scary as it looks, right? So what a DAG is it's a visual diagram, right, of the hypothesized relationship between the exposures, right? So these are our devices, right? Either one of the mechanical CPR devices, and the outcome. So we'll start with ROSC and all the other variables that we're looking at or the authors were looking at in this study, right? So it's going to help researchers decide which variables they need to adjust for, and importantly, which ones not to adjust for, right? And this matters because adjusting for the wrong variables, right, it can introduce bias, and just like omitting variables can introduce bias. They can go in either direction, right? So what a DAG helps us do is it helps us identify confounders, right? So these are things that we want to adjust for, and these are things that are going to affect both devices. I'm sorry, both the choice of device and ROSC independently, right? So they must be adjusted for. They're going to affect the exposure and the outcome. So those are things you absolutely want to adjust for, and then we call these confounders. Um, we'll talk about some things on the causal pathway, right? So they end up somewhere between the device and ROSC. These are called mediators, and adjusting for these, you wouldn't want to adjust for these, right? Because these are they're going to block the effect. The analysis by adjusting for them is going to block the effect that you're actually trying to measure. So it makes you certainly wouldn't want to adjust for mediators. And then there are things that we call colliders, right? So these they also affect both. These are caused by the exposure and the outcome, right? So adjusting for these, they actually could make you find some associations that are what we call spurious, or just due to chance alone, that you wouldn't otherwise find. So what I'd like to do, Dr. Crow, if you kind of with that background, and if I explained anything wrong, check me here. But also with that background, can you kind of walk us through this DAG?
Absolutely. And so again, I agree. This looks, really scary, but these are the things that we're naturally doing in our heads anyway as we set up. So the question that I ask myself when I'm thinking through a DAG is, what other things could potentially explain the relationship between the thing I'm studying and the outcome I'm studying? The what ifs, if you will. What will reviewer number 2 come and ask me about if I don't think about putting it in my model? And then Tony really nicely described what a confounder is. And there's something in epidemiology called the confounding triangle. And what that means is I want an arrow pointing out of the confounder towards the exposure, which is a device type here, and towards the outcome, which is both ROSC and survival here. And so we can see, just as an example here, that the treating agency is pointing at a lot of different things that lead to, one, the device type, because your agency is going to determine which device is available, or if the device is available, and on which vehicles it's available, as well as some of the things like, am I going to start IVs or IOs as first line treatment? And so thinking through some of these things, if it doesn't have an arrow pointing at both the device type and the outcome, then we would not want to include it in the model. Doing so would inflate odds ratios potentially, or adjust away effects that are truly there. Another example that I like to use in resuscitation research is, let's say that device type influences interruptions in CPR. And we believe that devices cause fewer interruptions because it's a machine and it just goes. And that we know that fewer interruptions probably create better ROSC and better survival. That's an example that's on the causal path. So if I adjusted for interruptions, now I'm potentially erasing some of the effect of the exposure that I'm looking to study. And so I have to be really careful here. And this is a very well done DAG that's thought out of, well, how do all of these different relationships influence each other? And should I actually be adjusting for each one of these, or can I adjust at a higher level and create a more parsimonious model, they call it, but what that means is just a simpler model. Simpler is better. So I won't go through each of these, but you all who work in the field know a lot of these very well, of the choice of airway, what type of cardiac arrest, or what is the suspected etiology of the cardiac arrest? Where did it happen? Was it witnessed or not witnessed? We know that all of these things influence our choices around how we approach resuscitation, and then they also influence the outcomes.
Yeah, and these are some really fun conversations that you're going to have with your author team putting one of these together. So it's really important. I'm glad that they highlighted it. The author team highlighted it in this project. I think it should be done more often. I think it does lead to a lot cleaner analysis. So those of you on this call and listening later, get familiar with these DAGs, because you're going to see them more often, and they are definitely not as scary as they look. Before we get to the results, and I know I'm holding us back for them as usual, but there are some secondary analyses that we do want to just mention, because I think they're really important in kind of contextualizing these results. So they did several additional analyses, basically to test, robustness, right, and address some specific concerns that might otherwise be mentioned by reviewer two had they not done these. And I wouldn't be surprised if reviewer two actually requested some of these. But let's talk about them. So excluding the rescue pump, that was one of them. That was a really important one. Most folks are familiar, right? This is kind of a hybrid device, but it requires a clinician for the compression and decompression phases. So there was concern. The concern there is that it could be classified as a Plunger-Type device. So the sensitivity analysis just excluded these patients. It was about 2% of the cohort, and we'll talk about what the results found there. They looked at agencies that use both types of devices, right? Because agencies that have the choice between a band type device or either device, they might systematically differ from those that choose there might be some differences for those that specifically choose the plunger when they have a choice, and those that choose a band when they have the choice. And just being able to kind of wash out some of that bias by specifically looking at those specific agencies, I think was really important. So you kind of think of this as a within agency comparison, right? So you're controlling for whatever makes one agency different from another one. They added an agency level out of hospital cardiac arrest volume. So again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, where they're looking at if you run hundreds of cardiac arrests a year versus maybe two, your system, your agency is probably different, and how you treat these patients is probably different. So you want to adjust for that in a sensitivity model. And then they looked at survival just among the transported patients without ROSC. So all of these really important decisions, and I think that they really help us understand the totality of their results. And with that, I will hand it back to Dr. Crow to take any questions from the rest of our panelists specific to methods before we dive into results.
All right, well, let's get ready to rumble. I really like this slide from Tanner for those who are watching live. All right, but it's the moment you have been waiting for. We'll dive right into the results of this study. And so the first thing that we like to start with is taking a look at the overall population numbers and the exclusions, especially exclusions due to missing data. So this is figure 1. It's typically where I spend a little bit of time when I'm evaluating a study and thinking about, if this is 100 patients, my level of certainty around this will be different than if it's 100,000 patients. And so we look at this and we see that the calendar years 2022 through 2024 of this national data set were used, which was about 400,000 out of hospital cardiac arrests, of which about 277,000 did not have any mechanical CPR, and so they were not eligible to be part of the study. EMS witnessed the cardiac arrest in another 16,000 cases, and so again, because the likelihood of survival is very different in that cohort was removed. So these are all cardiac arrests that happened prior to EMS arrival. Removing the traumatic etiologies for traumatic circulatory arrest, again, very different survival expectations and different approach to whether chest compressions are even indicated. And then removing the pediatric patients and the patients who are older than 80 years of age, again, pediatric patients not indicated for these devices, and the older cohort with the greater comorbidities and the greater challenges associated with potentially introducing bias here, it was a cleaner cohort to remove, and that can be something that can be studied in the future for sure. Removing anything that was an interfacility and not a primary 911 scene response, advanced directives, DNR, and then in records where there was no documentation of the actual time that the mechanical CPR was initiated. So that's a 38,000 exclusion. And so we should think about that. And that's something for us to think about as field providers is even if we don't have an exact timestamp, the approximate timestamp or the relative timestamp to other procedures is a really key piece of information. And then the last 2 exclusions here are that if ROSC occurred prior to putting on the mechanical CPR device, those patients are excluded. There's some of that mortal time bias out the window. And then if this occurred within a healthcare facility, again, different resources available, different expectations there. All in all, that leaves us with 38,000 patients to study here. And that is a very large, reasonable number, the majority of which, nearly 90%, were resuscitated using a Plunger-Type device, while the remaining 10% received the band-type device. So this is already an imbalance that we need to keep in our minds. That's why it's important to go through those initial tables and figures to understand who this population is and how they might or might not look like the population in my system. And so already we know that vast majority of these patients receive Plunger-Type, with fewer receiving the band-type. Now, the next place I want to go is straight into table 1. And so in table 1, start off with, again, looking at those 2 cohorts and seeing if there's anything really different between them that we should keep in mind as we get into some of the outcome analysis. And so starting off with things like the Utstein criteria, we need to know their age, their witness status, all of those things. We can see that generally these cohorts are pretty similar. The median age was 62 years in both groups. The response time was a median of 6 minutes in both groups. The on-scene time to mechanical CPR was similar but different. And this is one where maybe when we get to the discussion, we could think through the why behind this. Now, these data aren't going to tell us the why, but we see that the time from on-scene to the mechanical CPR for a Plunger-Type device, median of 4.7 minutes compared to 5.6 minutes in that band-type group. But then moving through some of the other demographics, again, really similar in terms of the gender composition, 33% female in both cases. Looking at witnessed, again, that's a huge variable that is known to be associated with outcomes at around 45 to 48%. And then breaking down the initial rhythm, 17% of patients in both groups presented in ventricular fibrillation. And so these are, again, just some of the characteristics that I would like to highlight. Table 1 has many, many more characteristics in it. And so encourage the readers to check all of that out. But I know that we want to get into some good discussion about this. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit into some of the results of the outcomes. First, let's talk about that primary outcome, prehospital ROSC. And so prehospital ROSC in the Plunger-Type group was 24.4%. And then when we compare that to the band type group, we see that was 22.3%. But remember, these are completely unadjusted. And so we should think about, are there other things that can explain these? And this is why, as Tony outlined, there were so many, there's a primary analysis, but then there's so many subgroup analyses to see, could one of these other things potentially be explaining or be altering the effects that we're seeing? And so we'll fast forward to the first forest plot here. And a lot of us have seen these forest plots before, but to orient us, there is a vertical line at 1, which is an odds ratio of 1. That is the line of no difference. And so if either the dot, which is our point estimate, or the whiskers coming out of the dot touch that 1, we can say there's no statistical significance. But in this case, we see that the dot and the 95% confidence interval, those whiskers, are fully to the left of that line. And what that means is that this favors the Plunger-Type device. And so we see an odds ratio of 0.87 here after adjusting for all of those things that Tony described, meaning that 13% less likely for the band type to experience pre-hospital ROSC, another way of saying that. So again, this analysis for pre-hospital ROSC in the primary group favored the Plunger-Type device. And then that number needed to treat there at 42. What this tells us is that although this is statistically significant, the effect size is relatively small. And an argument can be made, relatively small in cardiac arrest is still a really big deal. But this is something important for us to keep in mind as we process the rest of these results. So that while in a big data set, sometimes we do find statistical significance, we do need to keep in mind that the actual clinical relevance may not be large here. But what I do want to draw your attention to is when we look at the different subgroup analyses. And so this is all of the different subgroups that were looked at. If we look at witnessed, unwitnessed, by rhythm, age groups, males, females, looking at the trend here, or the direction of the effects, most of these, all of the dots, in fact, are to the left of that line, meaning that they favor the Plunger-Type device, though the precision here, the wide confidence intervals do cross 1 in a lot of cases, meaning no statistical significance. But this is, a signal. And in a lot of times in observational data, what we get is signals, and what we get is a call to do more research, to do that prospective work. But this says, hey, there is something here that may be worth studying. And then I do want to highlight quickly another one of the subgroup analyses where, excluding that rescue pump, where it does require manual effort from one of the clinicians, still see the persistence of that effect where everything is to the left of that line of no difference, favoring the Plunger-Type device. For the agency that used both types, similar results. And then when we think about the number of patients that were resuscitated as a marker of potential experience, and maybe these agencies train more, they have more exposure, they have less skill fade, again, the results persisted. Many of the subgroups, the confidence intervals, again, crossed 1. I don't want to overstate results, but is there a signal present? I think the answer is yes. Is this definitive proof? No, definitely not. And we should interpret these results with caution. As researchers, we need to stay humble and stay curious and know that at any moment we need to be ready to adapt when another study comes out with methods that overcome some of the limitations that were present in this kind of data set. So as far as the secondary outcomes, importantly, there was no difference found in the odds of survival. Again, the overall conclusion from the results here are that there's probably a modest association that favors the Plunger-Type device, but there's no clear winner when it comes to the hospital survival outcome. Again, smaller sample, lots of reasons for that, but this is something for us to take into account. ROSC is a process measure. ROSC doesn't always translate directly into survival, but it is something that is closest to the EMS treatments and definitely a good outcome for us to study. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for the last few minutes here to get into some discussion. And so Michael, I'll invite you to join me and let's talk through, what does this mean? What do we do with this study now?
Oh, I think that's a great question. And I applaud you and Tony for being able to explain a DAG. It doesn't come up as commonly, but it definitely helps us explain a lot more of the research outcome. So a couple of things just reading Dr. Smita's work and sort of that I thought came out is there's really not another large scale trial that looked at pre-hospital data on these two devices. There is some hospital data, and they cited a Korean study that sort of looked at a similar device. I think it's always tough to compare a result from inside the hospital versus outside the hospital. So while they do cite that in their methods or in their results, or in their discussion, wow, I don't know that I think it favors one side or the other. So again, it's always tough being the first people to come up with some results because everyone's going to say we need to replicate this, right? And good research is replicatable. So I would completely agree with what you're stating, which is we need to be cautious. I don't think this would cause me as someone who leads our agency to go say we're going to switch devices, right? I think more research in that direction will likely get us a better answer on this. A couple of things that they did note, which I thought was really important in their discussion, was a couple of the strengths in terms of being able to look at exposure time. We shared that in the methods, and I would just highlight that as a big strength of this study. And we will likely see more studies that start to do that because, again, we can sort of pick this exposure time. The reason we don't have a lot of other data that looks at this is because that time 0 point is quite difficult in documentation to try and find. I also thought they also noted that again, they utilized EHRs, and one of their limitations that I thought was important, there was a good number, they excluded greater than 90% of the cohort because hospital disposition data was unavailable, and transport times were only available in a rare amount of that data set. So as we continue to look to the future where we can link hospital data and pre-hospital data with the bidirectional data exchanges, that's going to help solve this question as well. But again, some of the limitations are we don't have the ability to connect those two data sets. So while we may know what device was used for cardiac arrest, we don't know if the patient got ROSC. We also don't know if the patient walked out of the hospital. So that in essence excludes all of those patients where we could improve there. So I thought the authors also did a nice job of talking about this number needed to treat as being 40. And they cited something that was interesting. In the Paramedic 2 trial, they demonstrated 1 milligram of epinephrine administered every 3 to 5 minutes during resuscitation had a number needed to treat of 5 for the same outcome. So to sort of only extrapolate on what Dr. Crow had said, which is the number needed to treat here is sort of large. It doesn't make a huge difference, and we probably need to ask more questions about that. There's other number needed to treat in cardiac arrest that look at similar things that have found small numbers, and probably some that have found a lot bigger numbers. But I thought that gives you a good categorization of whether or not that 42 is a big deal or not. Again, you're going to have to do CPR on 42 people in order to see a difference with the plunger versus the band type. So I think that gets us to the conversation which it seems like a lot of people have had over the last 6 months, which is we looked at devices here. We did not look at mechanical versus performance-based or human-based CPR devices. So I think that's maybe where the discussion leads us, which is we still don't have an answer to that question. And now we're looking even deeper into the devices, which sort of here we say, there is a signal here, but we're going to tread lightly. Any thoughts, Dr. Crow, or anyone else from the panel? Those are my takeaways from the discussion.
Yeah, and my takeaways are very well aligned with this conversation. And I think this is where research and implementation science come together. So EMS implementation science is key because even the best device in the world could perform poorly if deployment doesn't match what's necessary. So if deployment means extended interruptions in CPR, or if we're delaying defibrillation or something because we're busy putting the device on, that's very different than if when I'm deploying a device like this as part of my implementation, I include the choreography around it and the expectations around minimizing chest compression interruptions and those kinds of things. And that's data that's not going to be present in this kind of an observational data set. And so again, this is where observational studies require a lot of humility as researchers. We didn't find the answer here. And in no way do we mean that to be go throw your device away. No, of course not. There's a potential that ROSC doesn't translate to meaningful survival benefit here. And again, with that smaller effect size, that's something that we should keep into consideration. But this is an area of science that we're going to want to continue to watch evolve. heard all of the controversy and a lot of the social media posts when AHA did not recommend routine use of these devices. But again, baby doesn't need to go out with the bathwater. We need to think about where is the time and place and why are we doing this? Intra-arrest transport, we know, is not an awesome idea unless there's something on the other side that I have to get to that's really going to change that patient's outcome. And so starting to think through when that makes sense, or if I do need to do intra-arrest transport, does that allow me to, as the clinician, be buckled in and increase safety? All of those things are really important here. But I do think that this study raises a lot of really good questions, and I hope to see that research continue.
Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned in the methods too was the time to place the device. It looked like it was less than a minute or so. So I'd be very interested to see the choreography, though. I think that can also go back to training, right? Was one device trained differently, right? We might think to ourselves, well, that just means one device is easier to put on. We certainly can't conclude that from this data set. But it does bring back the question of what if you just train on high quality CPR without the inclusion of a new device? Would you see your results go up versus introduction of a new device? I think that's one of the sort of questions that we may not have an answer to, but the thought is if you do a bunch of training on a new device, you probably get better at all the ancillary things: medication administration, capnography, intubation, chest compression quality, all of those good things that we know have been demonstrated to improve some outcomes like chest compressions and early defibrillation. So I don't know, I think that's one of the things that's always in the back of my mind is, does the training make a difference? And maybe if we train to put the device on faster, but that changes that number. But kind of an interesting sort of tidbit of data that came out of this study. Jeff, what were your thoughts?
My thoughts were that this was definitely an excellent study and great to go through the methods, through the results, that DAG that kind of so nicely explains many of the aspects to this. But I think some of those framing questions that I was talking about and mentioning in the beginning are still somewhat unanswered when we're talking about these different devices. Some of these purchasers, medical directors, EMS clinicians, maybe were trying to decide, okay, one is clearly better than the other, but we know that there's a lot more going on and that we definitely see a bit of a signal here, but still not quite clear if that's just the machine itself or all these other factors like training and that choreography. So I think this is excellent research, and I don't want to say that phrase, more research is needed. We always hear that, but just showing that I think for folks that are trying to make these decisions, they need to factor in the other aspects as well. And just want to thank Dr. Smita right here. You can see he's with one of these devices. Looks like they just took the Lucas off the Plunger-Type device, and appreciate his excellent work on this.
And I'll echo that. I think this paper highlights a lot of things, and one of the things that it highlights is how far EMS observational research has evolved. So there's a time when I couldn't have imagined we'd be talking about DAGs at an EMS conference, and Dr. Smita got to present this at NEMSP as an oral presentation and educated all of us on DAGs. I think that's really great to see. Also, this concept of target trial emulation and being careful about when time zero starts, that we don't inadvertently introduce things like immortal time bias, the mixed effects modeling to take into account the EMS agencies. And one of the things we didn't see when I presented results was all of the other odds ratios for the variables that were in the model. And the reason those were not included is something called the table 2 fallacy. So avoiding this notion of looking for other odds ratios of variables that were just in the model as confounders, because the model wasn't designed to test those associations. And so we should divert our focus from them, or else we could come up with an incorrect conclusion there as well. All of those sensitivity analyses in a pre-hospital paper like this, so important to see that the direction of the finding did not shift, so that there was a consistency there that makes this a bit more robust. But for me, I'll take us out because I know that we're at time. I don't think this paper proves that one device is superior than the other, but from an operational standpoint, I'd focus less on who's the winner and more on how well are you deploying the device that your operation chooses to use. Interruption quality, timing, all of those things probably matter more. But this is an exciting time, and it's exciting to see the types of studies that these large data sets are making possible. And I do want to extend a sincere thank you and a congratulations to Dr. Smita. His work here won Best Student Research at NAMSP, and very well deserved. It's exciting to see the resuscitation science coming out, and we're certainly looking forward to more of it. But now I do have that unpopular task of wrapping us up. So just to remind everyone, we do have the education version of this Journal Club podcast. It'll be Friday, May 29th. And then we'll be back here next month with the clinical podcast, second Monday of every month, which should be June 8th. I want to thank you all for listening, encourage you to stay curious, and we look forward to being with you next time.
We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF at UCLA and on our website, prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsors, Limmer Education, providing educational tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey, and ESO, dedicated to improving community health and safety through the power of data.